They called it the Cold War, but nothing about it was truly cold. Beneath the icy language of diplomacy and the frozen smiles of politicians, the world simmered with tension, suspicion, and surreal contradictions. It was a war where no battles were declared, yet the entire planet became a battlefield of minds, ideologies, and invisible lines drawn in the psyche of nations. This was an age where peace was kept through the threat of total destruction, where children practiced hiding under desks from bombs that would leave nothing behind, where entire cities were mapped out not for protection, but for obliteration. Leaders smiled for cameras while signing papers that guaranteed mutual annihilation. And behind every curtain, someone was always listening. It wasn't just politics, it was theater, illusion, a dream layered with nightmares. Espionage became art, information became currency, truth bent until it broke, then was reassembled and sold as certainty. In this story, we drift into that eerie dream, not of war as we know it, but of war that watched itself. A war that dreamed of itself in silence. And so it begins. The most surreal events of the Cold War, as history dreamed them. It began with a handshake, a photograph, a press release, two nations, one flag in each corner of the room, smiling faces beneath the heavy shadow of intercontinental missiles. The paradox was born there, in a room where peace treaties were, signed under the hum of nuclear readiness alerts. During the Cold War, the friendliest nations sometimes harbored the most dangerous threats. Take the case of NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization was built on mutual defense. An attack on one was an attack on all. But within that circle of trust, there existed a quiet terror. Nuclear weapons pointed not just at enemies, but quietly hedged against allies, just in case loyalty wavered. The United States deployed nuclear warheads in Western Europe, ostensibly to deter the Soviets. But many European leaders whispered fears that they were not just protected, they were targets too. A wrong move, a shift in politics, and the umbrella could become a cage. Britain, a close US ally, even developed its own deterrents, not solely against Moscow, but in part to maintain sovereignty from Washington. Friendship became strategy. Strategy became paranoia. In 1983, a Soviet early warning system mistakenly detected incoming US missiles. Stanislav Petrov, the duty officer, broke protocol and refused to report the launch. His gut, and perhaps his fatigue, prevented full-scale retaliation. He saved the world that day, not with bombs, but with disbelief. In a world governed by automated threat responses and pre-signed retaliation orders, survival depended on moments of human hesitation. It's surreal how close the world came to vanishing over phantom data. Yet the nations involved remained in alliance talks, military drills, and diplomatic dinners. Behind each formal nod was a double check of the button. Each friendship had a shadow, shaped like a missile, hidden under treaties and spoken of only in classified rooms. Operation Gladio in Europe added another twist. Designed as a secret resistance network against potential Soviet occupation, it eventually blurred into political manipulation and potential domestic terror, all under the justification of preventing communism. The good guys played dangerous games in their own backyards, planting fear like landmines across democratic streets. Even stranger, the US at one point considered Project Excalibur, a nuclear-powered laser weapon. It never left the drawing board, but its conceptual purpose said everything. a weapon designed to surgically shoot down enemy missiles, launched perhaps by the very countries it promised to protect. This is not how peace usually looks. This is how a world at war with itself hides in plain sight. The paradox of the friendly nuclear threat is that the more closely nations embraced, the more reasons they had to fear betrayal. Nuclear weapons were not just deterrents, they were chess, pieces in an alliance where every player smiled through their teeth. The handshake was firm, the weapons were ready, and the targets were flexible. In dreams, sometimes the thing that protects you is the same thing that might destroy you. And in the Cold War, dreams and nightmares were often drawn with the same pen. This was not just a war of ideology, it was a war of illusion, of security that felt like a loaded gun resting gently against the back of your skull, held by the hand you just shook. And still, they called it peace. The Cold War was a masterclass in contradictions, but none more symbolic than the image of the Berlin Wall, the ultimate monument to a world split in half that claimed to be fighting for unity. On paper, both the East and the West claimed to be the true defenders of freedom, prosperity, and peace, but their methods, their ideologies, their weapons, all screamed division. They didn't just divide a city, they divided a species. The phrase "United Front" was repeated like a sacred mantra throughout the Cold War. The Western Bloc rallied under NATO, the Eastern Bloc under the Warsaw Pact. Each promised mutual protection, shared values, and common purpose. But behind the banners and official speeches, unity was a fractured illusion. In the East, Soviet satellite states like Hungary and Czechoslovakia quickly realized that unity meant obedience. The moment a nation deviated from the Kremlin's vision, tanks rolled in. The Hungarian uprising of 1956 and the Prague Spring of 1968 exposed the rot in this united ideal. Unity, it turned out, came at gunpoint. In the West, the illusion was subtler. The United States and its allies preached cooperation, but even among friends, suspicion festered. France, under Charles de Gaulle, withdrew from NATO's military command in 1966, citing concerns over US dominance. Britain, though loyal, quietly feared that American foreign policy could drag Europe into a war it didn't choose. Germany was the battleground, not just physically, but ideologically, a country split into two, where families were torn apart by a wall built overnight. The Berlin Wall wasn't just concrete and barbed wire, it was a physical manifestation of a psychological war. One half of the city claimed it was protecting its people from fascists. The other half said it was shielding them from communism. Yet both sides used propaganda, surveillance, and control to maintain their version of truth. The people caught in the middle became pawns in a silent struggle that didn't care about their dreams, only their allegiance. And then there were the spies, double agents who pledged loyalty to one side while secretly feeding information to the other. Men and women who believed in nothing but survival. Their lives were defined by masks, and their careers ended not in retirement, but in silence, often underground, often forgotten. The story of Kim Philby, the high-ranking British intelligence officer who was secretly working for the Soviets, became one of the Cold War's most chilling reminders that even your allies could be enemies. In disguise, international events echoed this paradox again and again. The Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, saw both the United States and the Soviet Union claiming to act in defense of global peace, while simultaneously pushing the world to the brink of nuclear war. Their united fronts were facades covering fractured minds, rival egos, and survival instincts masquerading as diplomacy. Even the United Nations, designed as a platform for global cooperation, became a Cold War battleground. Veto powers were wielded like weapons. Speeches were less about solutions and more about symbolism. It became a theater of staged unity, where the actors barely pretended to believe the script. The divided United Front wasn't a flaw in Cold War logic, it was its core. Nations couldn't afford to truly trust one another, even when they stood shoulder to shoulder. Unity was a costume worn at summits and parades. Division lived underneath it, humming like static beneath polite conversation. This paradox extended beyond geopolitics and into the personal. People distrusted neighbors. Children were taught to fear entire countries. In both East and West, loyalty was prized, not because it meant harmony, but because betrayal was expected. Everyone was united in fear. The Cold War's most surreal truth is that a world claiming to fight for unity became more fractured than ever. The wall in Berlin may have fallen, but the invisible walls, the ones in our minds, lingered for decades. Some are still standing. A divided world pretending to be united is more dangerous than one that admits its fractures. At least then, we know where the edges are, but in the Cold War, you never knew, because the most dangerous front was the one smiling at you. Propaganda is usually defined by its distortion of the truth, a slick, manipulative tool designed to shape perception and control minds. But during the Cold War, a strange paradox emerged. Propaganda that told the truth, or at least just enough of it to be undeniable. It became a weapon not of lies but of selective truth, crafted so carefully that it became more dangerous than pure fiction. This was propaganda that looked like journalism, sounded like logic, and felt like morality, while still steering entire populations toward the edge of paranoia. Both the West and the East built entire empires of media designed not just to promote their ideologies, but to control the very idea of what truth meant. In the Soviet Union, newspapers like Pravda, ironically the word means truth, were filled with glowing reports of progress, unity, and industrial success, even during times of famine, oppression, and revolt. But mixed in with the fabrication were moments of strange honesty. When things went wrong that couldn't be denied, Soviet media would acknowledge problems and then redirect blame to imperialist forces, internal saboteurs, or capitalism's corrosive influence. The facts were there, but only the ones that supported the story. In the West, the approach was more sophisticated. The United States Information Agency, USIA, operated with a budget of millions to create films, radio broadcasts, posters, and pamphlets that promoted American values across the globe. Radio Free Europe and Voice of America broadcast into Eastern Europe with real news, but news curated to emphasize the failures of communism and the successes of capitalism. They weren't always lying, but they were always choosing. Omissions became strategy, and that's the heart of the paradox. The Cold War propaganda machine didn't always lie. It didn't have to. Instead, it filtered the world until only one version remained, polished and positioned for maximum psychological effect. Truth became a shapeshifter, not falsified, just focused. Like a spotlight in a dark room, it revealed what the designers wanted you to see while leaving everything else in shadow. Consider the CIA's influence over Hollywood during the Cold War. It's now documented that the agency worked behind the scenes to shape scripts, edit dialogue, and approve storylines that portrayed the US as heroic and righteous. In many cases, they didn't invent heroism. They just made sure it was the only thing you saw. Action films, spy thrillers, even science fiction became subtle battlegrounds for ideological warfare. Meanwhile, in the East, filmmakers were given state-approved scripts, producing films that glorified the worker, the soldier, and the collective dream, even if it meant erasing the individual voice in the process. But propaganda wasn't just about media. It leaked into classrooms, textbooks, museums, and architecture. In both the US and the USSR, students were taught a version of history that supported the current narrative. Heroes were built, villains were simplified, and uncomfortable truths were swept under patriotic rugs. One of the most surreal examples came during the Vietnam War. While the US government tried to maintain a positive public image, uncensored footage from journalists, real images of bombings, civilian casualties, and protest movements began to surface. The result? Truth broke through propaganda, and the propaganda machine began co-opting that truth to shift the narrative. Suddenly, "We regret these losses" became part of the story, even as the machinery of war kept turning. It was no longer enough to lie. The Cold War taught nations how to weaponize honesty, to use selected truths as psychological tactics. Real stories, edited just enough to stir emotion without awakening full doubt. It was propaganda that could quote statistics, cite sources, and still distort your worldview. Even now, decades later, the legacy of this paradox lingers. Trust in media remains fragile. The idea of objective truth feels more elusive than ever. The Cold War didn't just teach us how to spin lies, it taught us how to decorate the truth until it lost its meaning. The truthful propaganda machine was not a contradiction in terms. It was a perfected art. It didn't ask people to believe lies. It asked them to believe only certain truths, and that made it more effective, more persuasive, and far more enduring than anything shouted from a podium. In a world where truth was filtered and weaponized, belief became a battleground. And everyone, whether in the East or West, became a soldier in a war they never fully understood. The Cold War was not marked by battles in the traditional sense. No great front lines, no trenches filled with soldiers, no bombs falling on cities like in the world wars that came before it. And yet, it was perhaps the most terrifying conflict in human history, because its peace was sustained by the ever-present possibility of absolute annihilation. The doctrine was simple, yet surreal. Mutually assured destruction, or MAD, as history would come to call it. If one superpower launched a nuclear strike, the other would retaliate instantly and overwhelmingly. The result? Total obliteration of both sides. Not just soldiers, but civilians. Not just cities, but entire nations. Not just victory or defeat, but extinction. And somehow, this logic held the world together. The arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union was not just about superiority. It was about balance, an unstable, trembling balance of terror. Each new missile, each warhead, each delivery system was justified not as a weapon to be used, but as a promise to never use it, so long as the other side believed in the promise too. In the 1960s, the US and USSR possessed thousands of nuclear warheads. Submarines prowled the oceans, capable of launching second-strike retaliation even if their homelands were already ashes. Bombers sat on runways, engines idling. Underground silos were staffed 24/7. This wasn't war. It was the constant rehearsal of apocalypse, with the hope that the performance would never begin. And yet, the world went on. Leaders met. Children played. Television ran comedy shows. All while the clock ticked closer to midnight on the doomsday clock, a symbolic reminder by scientists of how close humanity stood to total destruction. One of the most haunting illustrations of this paradox came during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. For 13 days, the world held its breath. The Soviets had placed nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of the United States. American reconnaissance confirmed their presence. The military urged President Kennedy to strike, to invade, to bomb, to act. But Kennedy hesitated. Khrushchev hesitated. Back-channel communications, secret letters, and the shared fear of mutual ruin eventually led both leaders to pull back from the brink. It was perhaps the closest we ever came to nuclear war, and it was prevented not by strength, but by shared vulnerability. Both sides knew they could destroy each other, and it was that knowledge, that horrifying guarantee, that prevented them from trying. What made this even more surreal was how ordinary life continued. Nuclear war drills in American schools had children ducking under desks, a gesture that would do nothing against an atomic blast, but served as a psychological cushion. Soviet citizens lived under similar illusions of preparedness, told that bunkers and warnings would save them. The world pretended that it had a plan for the end of the world. Books were written, films were made, civil defense guides were printed and distributed. Governments spoke of survivability, but deep down, everyone knew if the missiles launched, there would be no real survivors, only ruins. This wasn't peace in any traditional sense. It was a standstill created by shared fear, a horror so vast that it kept fingers off buttons and soldiers behind lines. The irony was brutal. The more capable the world became of destroying itself, the less likely it became to try. And still, the weapons multiplied. Scientists and strategists pushed forward, developing hydrogen bombs hundreds of times more powerful than those dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Delivery systems became faster, stealthier, deadlier. Peace depended not on trust, but on the mathematical certainty of devastation. This is the paradox of peace through annihilation, that what kept the world from war was not hope, nor diplomacy, nor morality, but the cold, unfeeling logic that destruction would be absolute and mutual. It was a peace shaped like a grave, and somehow it worked. The Cold War ended not with a war, but with a whimper. The slow collapse of the Soviet Union, the shifting tides of history, but the weapons still exist. The logic still lingers. And the question remains, was that truly peace or just a pause? Because in the Cold War, peace was not the absence of war. It was the constant presence of its ghost, looming, waiting, watching. The Cold War was never officially declared, never formally begun, and never properly ended. There were no signed declarations of hostilities, no traditional battlefields lined with opposing armies, and no agreed conclusion with clear winners and losers. And yet, it was one of the most intense and widespread conflicts in modern history. A war that was everywhere and yet nowhere. A war that hid in plain sight. This was the paradox of the invisible open war. Unlike previous wars, The Cold War was fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with ideology, espionage, sabotage, manipulation, and perception. It unfolded across continents, in classrooms and embassies, on television screens, and in space. It was a war waged through whispers, radio waves, and headlines. A war of influence more than invasion, of presence more than conquest. Nations weren't just armed with weapons, they were armed with narratives. Every word, every gesture, every scientific achievement became a battle tactic. When the Soviet Union launched Sputnik in 1957, it wasn't just a scientific milestone. It was a loud signal that communism had reached space before democracy. The West panicked not just because of the satellite, but because of what it symbolized, a shift in global prestige. That's what made this war so strange. Most of the battles weren't physical, they were symbolic. The space race wasn't about the moon. It was about domination of the skies and the psyche. The Olympic Games weren't just sporting events, they were proxy wars where gold medals became national victories and athletes were soldiers in tracksuits. Spies became some of the most important soldiers in this invisible war. Agents like Aldrich Ames, Oleg Penkovsky, and the infamous Cambridge Five passed secrets that altered diplomatic relations and military strategies. These people worked not with guns, but with classified files, microfilm, and forged identities. Betrayals were whispered, not shouted. Entire operations collapsed not from explosions, but from information slipping silently through the cracks. This war seeped into the everyday. In American suburbs, people built bomb shelters next to their gardens. In Soviet cities, children were taught about capitalist corruption from their earliest schoolbooks. Every movie, every news broadcast, every advertisement became a potential battleground. The media was not a bystander. It was a weapon. False information, planted stories, and misinformation campaigns blurred the lines between truth and manipulation. The CIA, for instance, conducted operations to influence European elections, fund sympathetic journalists, and even publish cultural magazines. The KGB responded with its own disinformation programs, aimed at spreading conspiracy theories, amplifying divisions, and casting doubt on Western institutions. Everyone was fighting. Most just didn't know they were soldiers. Even economic aid was weaponized. The US launched the Marshall Plan after World War II, offering massive financial support to rebuild European economies. But it wasn't just about rebuilding. It was about preventing communism from taking root. The money came with strings attached, ideological alignment. In response, the USSR created its own economic networks in the Eastern Bloc, creating a world where financial aid doubled as political control. The front lines of this war were constantly shifting. One moment it was Berlin, the next Korea, then Cuba, then Vietnam, then Afghanistan. But there was never a singular final battle, no dramatic standoff to decide the outcome. The Cold War was 1,000 small fires, each feeding off the others, sustained by fear, pride, and ambition. And yet, it was open. Everyone knew it was happening. Every newspaper carried the latest developments. Every citizen, on both sides, lived with the understanding that something vast and hostile was unfolding. But because it was never officially declared, it could also be denied, redirected, hidden. It gave leaders plausible deniability and allowed them to act with subtlety or with brutality, depending on what the illusion required. This was the great irony and tragedy of the invisible open war. It asked people to live in a constant state of tension without ever giving them a clear enemy or end goal. It demanded sacrifices in freedom, privacy, and sanity, all while pretending that peace still reigned. In the end, the Cold War didn't leave behind a battlefield of broken cities. It left behind something stranger, a fractured global psyche, a world that became used to watching its own reflection and wondering who was really watching back. This was a war where silence was louder than bombs, a war that everyone fought, yet few could name, a war so open it became invisible, and yet its shadow is still here, hiding behind screens woven into politics, humming in the background like a ghost too clever to die. During the Cold War, not all enemies wore different uniforms. Some sat at the same table, smiled during summits, shared intelligence, treaties, and military drills. But behind closed doors, they spied on each other, sabotaged each other's operations, and prepared for the day friendship would fail. This is the paradox of the Allied silent enemy. A reality in which allies were also threats, and loyalty was always conditional. The Western Alliance, led by the United States and cemented through NATO, appeared unified on the surface. It presented a collective front against the Eastern Bloc, against communism, against Soviet expansion. But within that alliance, cracks were everywhere. The United States surveilled its allies, doubted their long-term intentions, and in some cases, directly, interfered in their politics, and the feeling was mutual. France, under President Charles de Gaulle, famously pulled out of NATO's integrated military command in 1966. De Gaulle distrusted the United States deeply, not just for its dominance, but for its unpredictability. He believed that in a nuclear crisis, Washington would protect its own interests first, even if it meant sacrificing European cities. So, France began building its own independent nuclear arsenal, to remain an ally while preparing for betrayal. And France wasn't alone. West Germany, while benefiting greatly from American protection, harbored quiet resentment about its divided state and its puppet-like role in superpower politics. Britain, though closer to the US, kept secrets and conducted its own surveillance operations, sometimes even monitoring American officials. These weren't rogue actions, they were strategy. Even among friends, secrets were currency. This strange double life extended to intelligence agencies. MI6 and the CIA worked closely, but always with caution. Mossad cooperated with the US on several operations, while also acting independently, sometimes aggressively, in ways that frustrated their so-called partners. Countries shared intelligence with one hand and kept classified files with the other. The trust was professional, but never complete. One of the most unsettling examples was the case of Günther Guillaume, a close aide to West German Chancellor Willy Brandt, who turned out to be an East German spy. His exposure in 1974 led to Brandt's resignation and a complete reshuffling of European diplomatic confidence. Even among trusted allies, infiltrators thrived. The fear wasn't just of enemies from the outside, it was of betrayal from within. The United States, despite being the head of the Western Bloc, had its own reasons for paranoia. Operation Chaos, a domestic CIA program, tracked not only anti-war activists, but also international visitors, some of whom were from allied nations. The US surveilled foreign embassies, sometimes bugging even the rooms of their supposed friends. Trust, even in peacetime, was treated as a vulnerability. Technology added another layer. The Echelon program, a global surveillance network led by the Five Eyes Alliance, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, was meant to monitor Soviet activity. But over time, it was used to monitor each other's citizens, leaders, and industries. Trade deals, diplomatic calls, private emails, all could be intercepted. All were considered fair game. Even within this elite group, the line between friend and suspect blurred. The Soviets experienced the same dissonance. Though the Warsaw Pact was presented as a united socialist front, the USSR often invaded its own allies to keep them in line. Most infamously in Hungary in 1956 and Czechoslovakia in 1968. These were not enemies. These were allied governments who dared to think independently. The message was clear. Loyalty was demanded, not negotiated. Even in shared projects, competition reigned. The US and Britain may have co-developed nuclear technologies during World War II, but by the Cold War, they were guarding their secrets again. Information was shared, but always in measured doses, because tomorrow's ally could be tomorrow's problem. This is the haunting nature of the Allied silent enemy paradox. Alliances were built not on deep trust, but on convenience and calculation. Everyone stood together, but each looked over their shoulder. The Cold War trained nations to think in terms of survival, not friendship. It created a diplomatic culture in which no relationship was safe, no handshake was unconditional, and no smile was free of suspicion. Allies were necessary, but never fully trusted. Agreements were inked, but always with escape clauses written in invisible ink. And though the Cold War officially ended, its logic didn't. Even today, modern alliances often carry the same silent tension. Intelligence agencies spy on each other. Governments cooperate in public while maneuvering in private. In a world shaped by Cold War logic, the greatest threat wasn't always your enemy. Sometimes it was the friend who knew you best. In the Cold War, freedom became a slogan, loud, repeated, and printed on banners. It was the word that leaders used to rally citizens, the justification behind military action, and the shining concept both sides claimed to defend. But somewhere, along the way, freedom became a cage. Surveillance became protection. Control became peace. And people were told they were free while living behind walls. This is the paradox of freedom behind walls. The Berlin Wall is the most obvious and haunting symbol of this idea. Erected overnight in 1961, the wall sliced through the heart of Berlin, dividing families, friends, and futures. The East German government claimed it was a protective barrier, an anti-fascist defense rampart, to keep out the dangers of Western influence. But in truth, it was a prison wall meant to keep its own people in. A line drawn not to defend freedom, but to limit it. But East Berlin wasn't the only place where freedom lived in a cage. Across the Soviet Union, the rhetoric of liberation was everywhere. Citizens were told they were building a workers' paradise, a classless society where everyone contributed equally. Dissenters were labeled threats to unity, not political prisoners. Borders were guarded. Travel was restricted. Voices were monitored. Still, official propaganda proudly claimed the people were free. Free from capitalism. Free from corruption. Free from Western lies. The irony was unbearable. The state defined freedom so narrowly that anything outside its version of truth became treason. In the name of protecting liberty, they silenced choice. Yet the West was not innocent in this paradox either. In the United States, the Cold War saw the rise of McCarthyism, a wave of paranoia that targeted supposed communists, sympathizers, and anyone who questioned the national narrative. Artists, academics, and journalists were blacklisted. Careers were destroyed. Lives were ruined. The land of the free became a place where thoughts were policed, where association with the wrong ideas could exile you from society. Citizens were encouraged to report suspicious behavior. Neighbors watched neighbors. Teachers kept files. And while people were told they were free, they lived under a soft kind of fear. The fear of saying the wrong thing, of thinking the wrong way. Freedom became conditional. Security agencies expanded across both East and West. The Stasi in East Germany maintained one of the most extensive surveillance networks in history. Almost every fifth citizen became an informant. Files were kept on ordinary people, their friendships, their opinions, their movements. The very idea of privacy dissolved, but all of it was justified as protection, a defense of their freedom. In the US, the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, conducted secret operations like COINTELPRO, targeting civil rights leaders, anti-war activists, and even sitting senators. Wiretaps, infiltration, psychological manipulation, all wrapped in the language of national security. And still, the country called itself the beacon of liberty. Even architecture reflected the paradox. Embassies were fortified bunkers. Airports were labyrinths of checkpoints and observation. Government buildings were wrapped in steel and suspicion. The physical world mirrored the psychological one, structured by walls, gates, locks, and guards. One of the darkest examples was the fate of Soviet dissidents. Writers like Alexander Solzhenitsyn and Andrei Sakharov were punished for expressing inconvenient truths. Their words were seen as weapons. Their ideas were treated like viruses. Some were exiled, others imprisoned, and yet, official channels insisted that Soviet citizens enjoyed intellectual freedom. On both sides of the Iron Curtain, people were taught to fear the other and to surrender their rights for safety. Fear was the invisible architect of every wall. And the higher the fear, the stronger the wall became. This paradox endures because it was never fully resolved. The Cold War taught us that freedom can be redefined by those in power, that walls don't have to be made of brick to be effective, that the promise of liberty can be used to justify control. And even now, decades after the Cold War's end, the echoes remain. Surveillance technology has grown, state power has expanded, and the line between protection and oppression has blurred again. We are still told we are free, even when the doors are locked. Freedom behind walls is not just a relic of the past. It is a lesson carved into concrete, whispered through wiretaps, and etched into the silence between propaganda and reality. It reminds us that real freedom doesn't come with conditions, and that when it's placed behind walls, physical or mental, it's no longer freedom at all. The Cold War was a masterclass in secrecy. Intelligence agencies operated in shadows. Files were locked in steel drawers, and whispers passed between double agents like contraband. But beneath the layers of espionage and encrypted radio signals, there existed a bizarre contradiction. The most important secrets were often the ones everyone already knew, truths that were too dangerous to say out loud, but too obvious to be ignored. This is the paradox of secrets everyone knew. Across East and West, governments carefully curated information to control perception, but some things could not be hidden. The presence of spies, the manipulation of the press, the real purpose behind military exercises, these were open secrets, facts everyone understood without needing confirmation. They weren't whispered in corners. They were simply accepted. In the Soviet Union, for example, citizens were told their elections were free and fair. Yet the results were known before the ballots were cast. Candidates were selected by the Communist Party, and participation was mandatory in practice, if not in law. Voter turnout was proudly announced at 99%. Everyone knew it was a performance, but questioning it out loud could cost your job or your freedom. In the United States, the government claimed that it did not assassinate foreign leaders, yet documents revealed plans to eliminate Fidel Castro through poisoned cigars and exploding seashells. The CIA's fingerprints were all over coups in Iran, Guatemala, and Chile. These were rumors first, later confirmed by leaks, but even before the proof surfaced, people suspected the truth. It was a secret that didn't need to be told. One of the strangest examples of this paradox unfolded in Berlin. The CIA and MI6 had, in the 1950s, launched Operation Gold, a plan to tap Soviet phone lines by digging a tunnel under East Berlin. It was a top-secret operation involving massive underground work. And yet, the KGB had known about it from the start. George Blake, a British double agent, had told them everything. But instead of exposing it immediately, the Soviets let the operation continue for a year, feeding false information, playing a long game with the enemy. Both sides were pretending not to know what they knew. Even within allied nations, secrets weren't truly secret. Politicians had affairs with intelligence operatives. Nuclear weapons were stored on bases that officially claimed to be unarmed. Entire cities, like the closed science cities of the USSR or restricted zones in Nevada, existed off the map, yet everyone near them knew exactly what was happening. This strange dance of denial wasn't just bureaucratic, it was psychological. People learned to split their minds, to live in two realities at once: the public truth and the private knowledge. You learned when to nod along and when to keep your mouth shut. You heard things, saw things, suspected things, but knew better than to confirm them out loud. In East Germany, the Stasi's reach was so total that families assumed someone in their circle was informing. Friends smiled politely, knowing they were probably being watched. At work, conversations were filtered. At home, radios were played just a little louder to muffle the whispers. Everyone lived in a state of rehearsed ignorance, and in the West, the media helped manufacture the same illusion. Journalists sometimes withheld information for national security. News anchors read government-approved lines during crises. When the U-2 spy plane was shot down over Soviet territory in 1960, Washington first claimed it was a weather plane, even though everyone knew otherwise. When the lie collapsed, embarrassment followed, not because the truth was shocking, but because the lie had been so flimsy. This paradox created a world where reality bent in quiet compliance, where truth lived just below the surface, and denial became a habit. It wasn't that people were fooled, it was that they learned to coexist with unspoken knowledge. These known secrets were more powerful than true mysteries. They shaped behavior without needing enforcement. They made people hesitate, self-censor, and conform. Because everyone knew, and everyone knew that everyone else knew, but nobody could risk saying it. Secrets everyone knew was not about hiding information. It was about keeping it suspended, visible but untouchable, like a shadow cast across the world, always present, always known, but never acknowledged. And in that silence, power thrived, because when a lie becomes a shared ritual, it stops needing to be defended. It simply becomes the air everyone breathes, thick, heavy, and invisible. The Cold War is often remembered as a time of careful calculation. Chess moves on a global board played by nuclear-armed superpowers. And yet, behind the image of cold logic and steady strategy was a swirling chaos. Proxy wars erupting unexpectedly, coups fueled by secrets, leaders rising and falling like dice thrown across history. It was a world of order on the surface, and total unpredictability underneath. This is the paradox of controlled chaotic order, a system that appeared stable, but was kept that way by constantly feeding instability elsewhere. At the highest levels, world powers maintained an image of control. Red telephones connected Moscow to Washington, treaties were signed with solemn expressions, and intelligence briefings spoke of deterrence, equilibrium, and strategy. But this control was often built upon madness. Covert operations, misinformation campaigns, rogue agents, and proxy wars that spiraled beyond the reach of those who started them. The Korean War was never officially declared a world war, yet it involved multiple nations and cost millions of lives. It began as a civil war, but quickly became a geopolitical firestorm. The US and China fought indirectly, the Soviet Union sent support, and the front lines moved like tides. There was no clear end. An armistice was signed, not a peace treaty, and to this day, the war has technically never ended. Vietnam followed a similar pattern. What began as a conflict between North and South Vietnam escalated into a chaotic jungle war involving the world's largest military power, and its eventual defeat by an enemy using guerrilla tactics, terrain, and sheer persistence. The American public, once convinced of the war's necessity, turned against it in waves. Images on television of burning villages, fallen soldiers, and frightened children contradicted the controlled narratives from Washington. And behind these wars were shadows: CIA operations to fund resistance movements, KGB efforts to destabilize governments, secret funding, smuggled arms, and entire ideologies delivered by briefcases, not bombs. The Cold War wasn't fought by two hands. It was waged by 1,000 fingers, all pulling in different directions. The Cuban Revolution is another illustration. Fidel Castro overthrew a corrupt regime and positioned himself as a nationalist leader. But when he aligned with the Soviet Union, the US responded with the failed Bay of Pigs invasion, an act of desperation hidden behind the veil of strategic containment. Chaos erupted, and from it came the Cuban Missile Crisis. 13 days where the world held its breath, teetering on the edge of nuclear war because of decisions made in backrooms, not battlefields. Yet through all of this, the global order held. The two superpowers never engaged in direct war. Treaties like SALT and START attempted to freeze the arms race. International institutions continued to function. To outsiders, the Cold War looked controlled. because the chaos was exported. Central America, the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and Africa became testing grounds for ideologies and weaponry. The superpowers kept their own borders quiet while encouraging conflict abroad. Regimes were propped up and then torn down. Rebel groups were trained and then abandoned. Dictators became allies, then liabilities. The result was a kind of violent equilibrium. As long as the chaos stayed out there, the center would hold. Even in Europe, chaos was contained beneath bureaucratic calm. Berlin was divided with precise lines. Soldiers stood in neat rows. Checkpoints operated with surgical consistency. But it took enormous pressure, surveillance, propaganda, psychological warfare, to keep that order from shattering. The intelligence community thrived in this paradox. Their job was to prevent disorder, but they did so by creating it elsewhere. Operation Chaos, Operation Mockingbird, Operation Cyclone, each one a carefully managed campaign that sowed disruption in the name of control. Every riot, every revolution, every report was both a threat and a tool. And no one could tell whether a crisis was a genuine uprising or the result of a long-game strategy played by invisible hands. The paradox is that the system worked in its own way. For decades, the world avoided a third world war. Global power structures remained intact. But this order wasn't peaceful. It wasn't safe. It was more like a machine held together by spinning gears. One jammed lever away from explosion. Controlled chaotic order wasn't balance. It was balance on a knife's edge, and for those living through it, the contradictions were maddening. Peace meant conflict elsewhere. Control meant secrets. Stability required permanent instability. The Cold War didn't prevent disaster. It institutionalized it, rebranded it, and managed it like a global business of tension. It was a world that appeared calm on the map, but burned beneath the surface. In the dark corridors of Cold War espionage, spies were the ultimate instruments of strategy. Men and women trained to deceive, manipulate, and vanish without a trace. But behind the disguises, behind the briefcases and dead drops, many of them were not just lying to the world, they were lying to themselves. This is the paradox of spy versus himself. When the agent tasked with protecting his country no longer knew who he truly served or even who he was. Espionage in the cold. War wasn't just dangerous, it was existential. The stakes weren't always measured in deaths or detonations, but in psychological fractures. Spies had to live multiple lives, believing contradictory truths, and navigate worlds where betrayal was both a tool and a threat. Consider Kim Philby, one of the infamous Cambridge Five, British intelligence officers who secretly spied for the Soviet Union. Philby rose through the ranks of MI6 while feeding secrets to Moscow. He wasn't just a traitor, he was a man split in half. His friends, colleagues, even his family believed he was a loyal servant of Britain. He gave lectures on Soviet threats while protecting those very threats in silence. In interviews later in life, Philby claimed ideological conviction, but his behavior often suggested something murkier. A man tangled so deeply in his own lies that belief itself became a mask. The same was true for Aldrich Ames, a CIA officer who sold secrets to the KGB. His betrayal cost lives. The identities of US assets in Moscow were exposed, and many were executed. Ames lived a life of luxury funded by blood money, all while walking the halls of Langley and shaking hands with those he betrayed. In private moments, he justified his actions. Sometimes it was about money, other times ideology, but beneath it all was a war raging within, between duty and desire, guilt and denial, self-respect and self-destruction. These weren't anomalies. The Cold War created environments where moral lines were constantly crossed, then erased. Spies were asked to manipulate people into betrayals, to seduce, to blackmail, to build trust only to weaponize it. Some could compartmentalize. Others broke under the weight. Double agents, triple agents, defectors. Each one a walking contradiction. Loyalty became a question of convenience, not conviction. One of the most unsettling cases was that of Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB colonel who secretly worked for British intelligence. Gordievsky believed he was acting for the good of the Soviet people by undermining its regime. But every day, he had to look Soviet in the eye, shake hands, repeat slogans, send friends to prison, or worse, he lived a performance so convincing that his own wife didn't know the truth. And when he was eventually exposed and exfiltrated, he left his family behind. His price for truth was silence, exile, and emotional ruin. In many ways, spies were not warriors, they were mirrors. They reflected the fears, lies, and contradictions of their time. They were told they were heroes, but trained to act like villains. They collected secrets while becoming secrets themselves. They were patriots on paper, but their methods stripped them of identity. A spy in the Cold War was not just at war with another country, he was at war with his own reflection, and the systems that created them knew this. Intelligence agencies monitored their own employees obsessively. Background checks, lie detectors, surveillance of their private lives, because they understood what the job did to the mind. Alcoholism, isolation, breakdowns, these were occupational hazards. Many spies died not in field missions, but from the slow corrosion of paranoia and duplicity. Some never knew what side they were truly on. The best spies were often the ones who had convinced themselves of their righteousness, no matter how tangled their motives. The Cold War didn't allow for simple heroes or villains. It produced people who were both, often at the same time. Spy versus himself is more than a psychological condition. It's the perfect symbol of the Cold War itself, a global conflict where appearances lied, where allies were enemies, where truth was split, and where survival meant deceiving not only others, but yourself. And in the end, many of these spies disappeared into history. Some defected, some died, some simply faded away, their files sealed, their names redacted. But the damage remained, in the people they betrayed, the lives they ruined, and the fractured identities they left behind. Because, in a war of shadows, the darkest battlefield is always within. In a world balanced on the edge of nuclear war, the Cold War superpowers did everything in their power to ensure safety. Not just military safety, but psychological safety. Citizens were promised protection, order, and stability. Governments issued survival pamphlets. Propaganda painted enemies as monsters and domestic leaders as guardians. But beneath every promise of safety lay a subtle manipulation. Fear was used to maintain control. The very thing people were being protected from became the tool used to keep them obedient. This is the paradox of safety from fear. a reality where fear wasn't eliminated to keep people safe, but cultivated to keep them docile. Fear was a strategic resource. In the United States, the Red Scare turned communism into an invisible plague. Politicians, entertainers, and even school teachers were accused of being Soviet sympathizers. Senator Joseph McCarthy led a wave of interrogations and blacklists in the early 1950s, publicly shaming individuals with little or no evidence. The idea was simple. If people feared communists everywhere, they'd embrace the government's authority as a shield, and it worked. Lives were destroyed, but public trust in government action surged. The Cold War needed enemies, not just across oceans, but inside homes and workplaces. By manufacturing fear, leaders became protectors. In the Soviet Union, fear was institutionalized even deeper. Citizens were taught to fear the West, not just its weapons, but its values, its art, its clothes, its music. Western culture was labeled decadent and corrosive. Listening to the Beatles or reading banned literature could mark someone as a dissident. The KGB didn't just punish enemies of the state, it created the perception that enemies were everywhere. Neighbors informed on neighbors. Children were taught to report suspicious behavior. Fear created a society where self-censorship became survival. But this fear wasn't raw chaos. It was carefully curated. Leaders on both sides offered protection, not from real, immediate threats, but from the terrifying possibilities they constantly advertised. Nuclear drills in American schools were more about conditioning than safety. Duck and cover exercises couldn't protect students from atomic blasts, but they instilled obedience and dependence on state authority. Fear kept the population alert and manageable. Entire policies were built on this logic. The Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, nicknamed Star Wars, was proposed by President Reagan in the 1980s as a missile shield to protect America from nuclear attack. The science was unproven and the costs enormous, but the message was clear. We will keep you safe, no matter how extreme the plan. The very act of proposing such systems reinforced public anxiety, which in turn increased political support. In the USSR, civil defense programs taught citizens how to respond to nuclear attack, but never questioned the state's policies that invited such threats. Gas masks, emergency bunkers, and patriotic posters were everywhere, constant reminders that danger was near, and only unity behind the party could prevent disaster. And while both sides proclaimed their desire for peace, peace was never the goal. Stability was. Predictability, control. Fear helped create that. By keeping citizens afraid of each other, of foreign powers, of invisible enemies, governments made themselves indispensable. This control wasn't just political, it became personal. People chose jobs, spouses, hobbies, and even thoughts that wouldn't attract suspicion. In both East and West, the safest life was the quiet one. Creativity, dissent, or even curiosity could become liabilities. The paradox deepens when we realize that much of the fear was based on real danger. The threat of nuclear war was genuine. Espionage was rampant. Proxy wars killed millions. The Cold War wasn't imaginary. It just required constant emotional maintenance, and fear was the fuel. Even when fear faded, its infrastructure remained. After the Cold War ended, many of the surveillance systems, emergency protocols, and propaganda strategies stayed in place. Governments had learned how effective fear could be. New enemies would soon replace the old ones. Safety from fear is a lesson in emotional engineering. It shows how easily fear, once introduced, becomes a self-fulfilling cycle, generating the very dependence it pretends to cure. It promises peace while stirring the storm. It comforts while unsettling. It protects, but only from dangers it carefully controls. In the Cold War, the safest citizens were often the most afraid, and in their fear, they became the most loyal, not because they trusted their leaders, but because they feared what might happen without them, and that perhaps was the most dangerous fear of all. They stood ready in silos beneath the earth, nestled in submarines drifting beneath oceans, perched on bombers circling in the sky, missiles capable of ending human civilization within minutes. At the height of the Cold War, there were over 60,000 nuclear warheads between the United States and the Soviet Union. They were engineered with precision, upgraded with urgency, and deployed with intent. And yet, they were never used, not once in direct conflict. This is the paradox of weapons without use, the deadliest machines ever built, designed not to destroy, but to sit in silence and wait. Nuclear weapons redefined the logic of warfare. They couldn't be used casually. Their very deployment would guarantee catastrophic retaliation. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, meant that if one nation launched, both would fall. There could be no winners, no battlefield triumphs, only radioactive ruin. Yet these weapons had to be real, visible, and terrifying in order to prevent exactly that. So nations poured trillions into weapons no one dared to fire. Missile tests lit up the sky. Warheads were paraded through Red Square and catalogued in Pentagon reports. Submarines capable of launching nuclear payloads from undetectable positions were kept constantly in motion. The US developed nuclear triad capability, air, land, and sea-based launch options, just in case one branch was wiped out in a surprise strike. All of it was theater, real, dangerous theater. The logic was twisted but effective. By building weapons too terrible to use, nations could avoid war. Threat became shield. Possession became deterrence. But that didn't mean these weapons were harmless. The psychological toll they took was immense. Children grew up with the image of mushroom clouds in their textbooks. School children practiced duck and cover drills, civil defense films, air raid sirens, and backyard bomb shelters were part of daily life. People learned to live under the shadow of annihilation. The weapons may not have been used, but their presence shaped minds, policies, and entire generations. And they nearly were used, many times. In 1983, the Soviet Union's early warning system falsely detected incoming US missiles. Stanislav Petrov, the officer on duty, chose not to report it as an attack. He had a gut feeling it was a glitch. He was right. If he had followed orders, a full-scale nuclear response might have been launched over a computer error. Civilization survived because one man hesitated. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, a Soviet submarine captain named Vasily Arkhipov refused to authorize a nuclear torpedo launch, despite being under attack by US depth charges. His decision prevented what could have become a global catastrophe. These weapons were never used, not because they failed to function, but because a few individuals chose to defy the systems around them. The weapons existed in a strange limbo, too real to ignore, too terrible to use. But that didn't stop leaders from planning for their use. Military strategists developed detailed protocols for nuclear warfare. Targets were selected. Blast radii were calculated. Limited nuclear war was debated in think tanks as if such a thing were possible. Presidents and premiers carried briefcases, like the US at nuclear football, to ensure constant launch readiness. These weapons shaped foreign policy. Treaties like the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, SALT, and START attempted to slow the arms race. Verification protocols, inspections, and diplomatic backchannels evolved to manage these sleeping giants. The goal wasn't disarmament, not really. It was containment, stability, delay. Meanwhile, new weapons were constantly developed. Neutron bombs, MIRVs, multiple independently targetable re-entry vehicles, tactical nukes, even weapons that would supposedly limit casualties by focusing. Radiation instead of blast were designed, all for war that no one could afford to start. The ultimate irony. Their success was measured by their absence. A good nuclear weapon was one that never had to prove itself. Weapons without use challenges our understanding of power. It reveals a world where dominance is built not on action, but on potential. Where peace isn't earned through diplomacy, but enforced through mutual fear. These weapons were symbols of restraint, not aggression, because aggression meant doom. And yet, the danger never faded. Even today, thousands of warheads remain, waiting in silos, lurking in submarines. The Cold War may have ended, but the logic it birthed persists. These weapons were never used, and for that the world is lucky. But their legacy is not peace. It is a constant reminder that sometimes the most powerful things are those we build not to use but to hold, like threats written in silence, ready, waiting, forever. Maps are supposed to tell the truth. They show us the world, divided into nations, borders, cities, and lines. They present a reality that seems fixed, orderly, and precise. But during the Cold War, maps became tools of deception. They didn't just reflect the world. They helped shape illusions. Entire regions were redrawn, erased, censored, or exaggerated for political purposes. What you saw on paper was not always what existed on the ground. This is the paradox of maps that lied. A world where geography wasn't about land, but about control over perception. In the Soviet Union, maps were state secrets. Civilian maps were deliberately distorted. Locations of military bases were omitted. Coastlines were redrawn. Streets were mislabeled. Travelers, even within their own country, often had no accurate map of where they were going. It wasn't just about hiding installations. It was about controlling reality. If a place didn't appear on a map, it didn't officially exist. And if it did exist, it only existed in the way the state described it. Entire cities were hidden. Known as closed cities, these locations didn't appear on official records. They had populations, industries, and infrastructure, but no public presence. People lived their whole lives in places that were cartographically invisible. Their existence was denied to the outside world, and often even to other Soviet citizens. To the cartographers of the Cold War, omission was as powerful as fabrication. The United States and its allies played their own cartographic games. During aerial surveillance, photographs of sensitive military sites were cropped or blurred before public release. Maps published by government agencies often left out classified facilities. Even commercial maps sometimes distorted certain features, not because they were inaccurate, but because they were made to be misleading. In Berlin, maps became weapons of ideology. Western maps labeled the city with democratic terminology, while Eastern maps used the language of socialism. The border between East and West Berlin was drawn and redrawn in propaganda, each side trying to claim legitimacy through cartography. To cross from one side to the other wasn't just a physical movement, it was a step into a different imagined world. Maps were used to justify wars too. In Southeast Asia, American military planners relied on maps of Vietnam and Cambodia that underestimated terrain complexity and misrepresented village locations. Mistakes weren't always innocent. Some were shaped by assumptions, others by wishful thinking. The lines drawn in Washington didn't match the mountains and jungles of reality, and thousands died because of it. In Korea, the division along the 38th parallel was a line drawn not by history, but by Cold War negotiation. Before the end of World War II, Korea had never been divided, but American and Soviet planners, with limited knowledge of the peninsula's geography, chose the 38th parallel as a quick solution, a temporary measure that became permanent. Two nations were born from a line that didn't reflect culture, language, or community, only politics. A single stroke of a pen became a wound that never healed. Even outside of direct conflict, maps were political tools. Nations inflated or deflated their territorial claims to influence negotiations, justify military presence, or control resources. Disputed regions were marked with assertive labels, shaded in bold colors, meant to signal not just geography, but dominance. And for ordinary people, these maps created a warped understanding of the world. Textbooks showed simplified diagrams. Atlases printed with ideological bias colored friendly countries in calm blue tones and hostile ones in red or black. Children grew up seeing the world not as it was, but as their governments wanted it to appear. The Cold War turned cartography into propaganda. Maps didn't just lie. They taught people how to believe in those lies. They created imaginary stability, drew borders over identities, and transformed uncertainty into apparent order. Maps that lied reminds us that even the tools we trust most, the representations of space and place, can become instruments of deception, that the world we think we see may be shaped by invisible hands, redacted corners, and purposeful distortion. In the Cold War, a map was never just a map. It was a story, a message, a battlefield in 2 dimensions, where power was printed in ink and truth was negotiated, not measured. At its core, the Cold War was a conflict of suspicion, a long, quiet breath held between nations, waiting for the other to strike first. But this was not merely a diplomatic unease. It went far deeper. Over time, suspicion hardened into certainty, and fear mutated into protocol. The worst-case scenario became the default setting. Governments no longer just responded to threats. They began to imagine them into existence and plan as if they were inevitable. This is the paradox of paranoia became policy. When fear becomes law, and imagining the enemy becomes a way of governing. In the United States, the Red Scare didn't just grip the public. It gripped the very structure of government. Intelligence agencies expanded their surveillance powers, not in response to actual attacks, but in anticipation of what could happen. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, built massive files on Americans who had committed no crimes. Political activists, civil rights leaders, and even celebrities were monitored, harassed, and labeled as potential subversives. Programs like COINTELPRO didn't target saboteurs. They targeted ideas. It didn't matter if a person had done anything illegal. If their speech, their friends, or their beliefs leaned too far from the status quo, they were watched. Fear wasn't just a response. It was a filter through which all action was taken. On the other side of the world, the Soviet Union mirrored this mindset with brutal efficiency. The KGB operated under the assumption that foreign influence was everywhere. Western literature, foreign radio broadcasts, jazz music, all were treated as ideological contamination. Entire campaigns were launched to root out cosmopolitan behavior. Foreign relatives were liabilities. A university student who read the wrong book might find themselves under investigation. This logic of preemptive suspicion didn't stay confined to intelligence agencies. It bled into diplomacy, military strategy, education, even architecture. Secret bunkers were built beneath cities, underground facilities, missile silos, emergency government relocation sites, all of them constructed based on a scenario that hadn't happened yet, but was treated as inevitable. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, this paranoia reached its peak. Miscommunications, mistranslations, and fear nearly triggered a nuclear exchange. At one point, a Soviet officer aboard a submarine refused to launch a nuclear torpedo, only because he doubted the authenticity of the orders. He defied his training and saved the world. The policies in place were not designed to slow conflict. They were designed to survive it. School children in the United States practiced duck and cover drills as if hiding beneath a wooden desk could shield them from atomic fire. Public service announcements instructed citizens on how to identify a nuclear blast. In the USSR, citizens were issued gas masks and taught how to seal windows with wet towels in case of chemical attacks. Both populations lived in a state of managed anxiety, with the state feeding just enough information to keep fear alive, but not enough to provoke revolt. Paranoia also reshaped technology. The US developed satellites, spy planes, and listening stations that could monitor Soviet activities from thousands of miles away. The Soviets responded with similar programs. These technologies didn't just observe reality, they began to shape policy based on shadows, hints, and vague signals. Decisions were made based on intercepted phone calls, blurry photographs, or a hunch from a tired analyst staring at a radar screen. This environment bred absurdity. In some instances, military commanders were given standing orders to launch counterattacks in the event of a communications failure, assuming that silence meant they were already under attack. Some protocols didn't allow for hesitation. Fear became automation, and in domestic life, the paranoia was internalized. Neighbors reported on neighbors. Teachers reported on students. Writers revised their work or abandoned it altogether. The desire for safety became indistinguishable from the fear of freedom. Trust was dangerous. Curiosity was suspect. Privacy was expendable. Paranoia became policy is more than a historical condition. It is a blueprint of how fear can colonize the structures of power. It shows how imagination, when corrupted by anxiety, becomes a tool of oppression. It reminds us that when leaders begin to act on what they fear rather than what they know, policy stops protecting people and starts controlling them. The Cold War didn't just teach us to fear the enemy. It taught us to fear possibility itself. And in that world, the most dangerous thing wasn't the bomb. It was the belief that it might already be falling. In traditional warfare, victory is clear. One side surrenders, flags are lowered, treaties are signed. But in the Cold War, victory didn't come with parades or peace declarations. It came slowly, quietly, and often through outcomes that looked like failure. The battles that were won left countries divided, economies wrecked, and millions disillusioned. Sometimes, the side that appeared to lose gained more in the long run, and the ones that claimed victory were left burdened, hollowed out, or transformed into something they never meant to become. This is the paradox of victory through loss, when defeat plants the seeds of power and triumph comes at the cost of everything else. Consider Vietnam. To most observers, the United States lost the war. After 2 decades of military intervention, vast expenditure, and more than 58,000 American lives lost, the final image was one of helicopters fleeing from rooftops in Saigon. It was a political and psychological blow, a wound on the American narrative of invincibility. But in the wake of that loss, America was forced to rethink its foreign policy. The defeat fueled protest movements, inspired a generation of critical thinkers, and exposed the limits of imperial ambition. Meanwhile, Vietnam, the official winner, emerged from victory into devastation. Its cities were in ruins, its people traumatized, its economy shattered. Years later, the Vietnamese government began adopting market reforms, ironically leaning toward many of the capitalist principles it had once fought against. The war was won, but the ideals that fueled it were compromised. The Soviet Union experienced its own version of this paradox in Afghanistan. What began as an attempt to support a communist-friendly government turned into a 10-year military quagmire. The Soviets sent hundreds of thousands of troops, lost thousands of lives, and faced mounting international condemnation. The war drained resources, exposed weaknesses, and ignited resistance movements across the Muslim world. Ultimately, the withdrawal was seen as a humiliating failure, but out of that loss came victory for others. The United States, which had secretly armed the Mujahideen, Pakistan, which gained strategic influence, and radical Islamist factions who discovered how to bleed a superpower. Decades later, the tools and fighters trained during that Cold War conflict would contribute to global terrorism. The loss created unintended victories, and the consequences of those victories became their own crises. Germany offers one of the strangest cases. After World War II, the country was split in half, East and West, becoming the symbolic fault line of the Cold War. East Germany was placed under Soviet influence, restricted, surveilled, and controlled. On paper, it lost its freedom. But the long arc of that struggle produced something unexpected. When the Berlin Wall finally fell in 1989, it marked not just the reunification of a nation, but the ideological unraveling of the Eastern Bloc. The loss of division became a symbol of global unity. Even the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, widely seen as the West's ultimate Cold War victory, was not without paradox. Capitalism had won, but it emerged from the Cold War distorted. The unchecked triumph of market ideology led to increased privatization, global inequality, and new forms of corporate dominance. The US, once seen as a stabilizing force, became overextended. Victory gave rise to uncontained ambition, and, with it, new vulnerabilities. The nations that emerged from the Eastern Bloc weren't simply liberated. Many faced economic chaos, political corruption, and cultural disorientation. Their independence came with a loss of certainty, structure, and identity. Winning freedom meant losing stability. This paradox extended to individuals too. Defectors who escaped communist countries were often hailed as heroes in the West, but many struggled with alienation, unemployment, and cultural shock. They had left behind everything they knew, only to find that the freedom they imagined was lonelier than expected. Victory through loss teaches us that Cold War wins were rarely clean and often double-edged. Each collapsed regime left behind chaos. Each ideological defeat planted a different seed of power. The global landscape was redrawn, not by clear winners, but by a chain reaction of unintended consequences. In this war of shadows and signs, winning didn't always feel like triumph. Losing didn't always mean defeat. And history, as it turned out, wasn't keeping score the way we thought it was. Because in the Cold War, the greatest victories often came with the deepest scars. Treaties are meant to bring peace. They are written, signed, and displayed as symbols of cooperation, resolution, and rational compromise. But during the Cold War, treaties took on a more ambiguous role. They were negotiated behind closed doors, loaded with technical language, and celebrated publicly, even as the parties signing them continued to prepare for war. These agreements were supposed to calm the world. Instead, they often whispered promises no one intended to keep. This is the paradox of silent screaming treaties, documents written in peace language that silently anticipated conflict. Consider the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, NPT, of 1968. Its goal was clear: prevent the spread of nuclear weapons while promoting peaceful nuclear energy and eventual disarmament. Yet the nations with the most weapons, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, the UK, and France, maintained their arsenals. The treaty created a system where the powerful kept their bombs, while the rest were told to trust the system. Disarmament was deferred indefinitely. Non-proliferation became a cage for some, a loophole for others. On paper, the NPT was a promise of safety, but its silent scream was this: the bomb isn't going anywhere. The strategic arms limitation talks, SALT I and SALT II, were similarly paradoxical. They aimed to slow the arms race by capping the number of strategic weapons each side could deploy. But neither treaty actually reduced existing stockpiles. Instead, they froze absurd levels of mutual destruction in place. The logic was, we'll stop adding more, but we'll keep what we have. Thousands of ways to end civilization. The image projected was stability. The reality was stalemate. And even this fragile stability could be shattered in a moment. SALT II, signed but never ratified by the US Senate, effectively died when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The treaty became a diplomatic ghost, cited in speeches, remembered in headlines, but stripped of all power. It still screamed, but no one listened. Meanwhile, other treaties were signed with the full knowledge that violations would be inevitable. The 1975 Helsinki Accords were meant to improve relations between East and West, promoting cooperation in areas like trade, science, and human rights. But for the Eastern Bloc, human rights were largely theoretical. Dissidents who tried to hold their governments accountable using the language of Helsinki were imprisoned or exiled. Treaties like this gave people hope, and then punished them for believing. Even more technical treaties, like the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, ABM Treaty of 1972, held layers of unspoken truth. By limiting missile defense systems, the ABM Treaty essentially guaranteed mutual vulnerability. It was an agreement not to protect your own population, in order to maintain the delicate balance of mutually assured destruction. It codified fear. Its silent message: safety lies in being just as exposed as your enemy. Arms control treaties didn't disarm the Cold War. They formalized it. They dressed the apocalypse in legal language, binding it in bureaucracy, while the warheads quietly hummed underground. Beyond the treaties themselves, the process of making them became its own kind of theater. Negotiations were long, slow, and filled with diplomatic rituals. Each word debated, each comma carefully placed. Delegates gave speeches while knowing their governments were simultaneously expanding arsenals, building new delivery systems, and training for total war. Treaties were as much about public perception as real change. A signature could calm the stock market. A handshake on the tarmac could distract from a proxy war. The documents gave politicians headlines and historians artifacts, while the world beneath the surface remained unchanged. And yet, despite all this, treaties mattered. Not because they solved anything, but because they revealed everything. They exposed how power feared itself, how nations felt compelled to promise peace while preparing for destruction, how leaders used words to hold back silence, even when that silence trembled with unsaid truths. Silent, screaming treaties are the Cold War's most haunting paradox. They show how diplomacy can be both genuine and hollow, how peace can be promised and postponed in the same breath. These treaties were not lies. They were confessions, carefully edited, dignified with signatures, echoing with the quiet sound of everything left unsaid. In the Cold War, the world didn't end with an explosion. It was held in place by pages that tried to keep the future from arriving, not with shouting, but with silence. In an age defined by secrecy, surveillance, and ideological war, the Cold War was not just a battle for territory or influence. It was a battle for reality. The two superpowers didn't just disagree on facts. They manufactured different versions of truth altogether, not once or twice, but every single day. News was curated, language was repurposed, events were reframed. Reality became less about what happened and more about who got to explain it. This is the paradox of truth engineered daily. When facts are constructed so carefully, consistently, and deliberately, that they feel more real than reality itself. In tow, the Soviet Union, the Communist Party controlled nearly every medium of public communication. Newspapers, radio stations, television programs, even novels and poetry. Every channel of expression passed through layers of state approval. The result wasn't just propaganda. It was a carefully constructed version of the world, rebuilt each morning in service of the party's goals. If the economy was failing, the papers reported record growth. If protests occurred, they were reframed as isolated acts by foreign-funded agitators. If a beloved figure fell out of favor, their image disappeared from photos, their name vanished from encyclopedias. Truth wasn't just managed, it was manufactured. But this wasn't unique to the East. In the United States, the shaping of reality was subtler, but no less persistent. News networks filtered coverage through patriotic frames. Government press briefings were rehearsed exercises in messaging. CIA-backed initiatives quietly influenced cultural institutions. Journalists who pushed too far were often marginalized or discredited. It wasn't that lies were broadcast openly, it was that certain truths were repeated so often and others so quietly ignored that public understanding became skewed without anyone realizing it. The process was invisible, but the effect was massive. Even language itself became a tool of distortion. In both blocks, euphemisms softened the edges of horror. The US didn't bomb civilians, it conducted strategic airstrikes. The Soviet Union didn't suppress revolts, it maintained socialist order. Political prisoners became enemies of the people or national security threats. Torture was enhanced interrogation. Censorship was editorial responsibility. When the truth is engineered daily, people stop noticing it's being built. They wake up inside a version of the world that feels normal, even when it's completely artificial. Schools played a critical role in reinforcing these narratives. Children were taught a history tailored to the needs of the present. Heroes were selectively chosen. Villains were simplified. Maps, textbooks, and lesson plans omitted contradictions. By the time students became adults, the story had settled inside them as fact. To question it was not only difficult, it was dangerous. Art, too, was pulled into the machine. In the USSR, socialist realism mandated that artists portray the world, not as it was, but as it should be. Smiling workers, glorious factories, perfect leaders. The goal was not to reflect reality, but to inspire loyalty to a constructed ideal. In the West, government-sponsored art exhibitions promoted themes of freedom, individualism, and innovation, subtly framing the capitalist model as not just successful, but morally superior. Even science wasn't exempt. During Stalin's reign, a pseudo-scientific theory called Lysenkoism, rejecting genetics in favor of politically favored agricultural dogma, was enforced despite overwhelming evidence against it. Scientists who disagreed were fired, imprisoned, or killed. The result was not just scientific stagnation, it was a chilling reminder that truth, under pressure, could be rewritten by authority. In intelligence circles, entire operations depended on this daily engineering of truth. Double agents created false trails. Deception campaigns planted fake stories in foreign newspapers. Some lies were crafted not to convince the world, but simply to make people doubt everything. A confused population, unsure of what to believe, becomes easier to manage. But the most tragic consequence of truth engineering was internal. People who lived under these systems often knew the narratives were false. They joked in whispers. They rolled their eyes. They taught their children to read between the lines. But over time, the layers of deception wore them down. When every story might be fake, when every headline might be hiding something, trust collapses. Cynicism becomes survival. Truth, engineered daily, is the story of how both sides in the cold. War didn't just fight over ideology, they fought over reality itself. Each sunrise brought a new version of truth, printed and distributed, taught and repeated, until no one remembered what the original looked like. And when truth becomes a product, something manufactured and molded to fit the needs of power, it stops being truth at all. It becomes control, and yet people lived within it. They navigated the lies. They searched for cracks. They built quiet, private truths of their own, buried under layers of official stories. Because in a world where truth is engineered daily, honesty isn't lost all at once. It fades piece by piece, until only silence remains. Power usually conjures images of freedom, the ability to act, to command, to move without restriction. But in the Cold War, those who held the most power were often those most tightly trapped. Presidents, generals, party leaders, spy masters. They seemed invincible from the outside, but many of them were bound by systems, ideologies, and fears so deeply entrenched that escape was impossible. They could command nations, but not change course. They appeared to rule the game, yet they were often just another piece on the board. This is the paradox of the prisoner holding power, when those in control discover that the very machinery they operate is what keeps them trapped. Nowhere is this more visible than in the leadership of the Soviet Union. From Stalin through to Brezhnev and beyond, the image of total control was carefully cultivated. The General Secretary was the face of the state, the voice of the revolution. But the system behind the face, the sprawling Communist Party, the vast bureaucracy, the KGB, the endless propaganda apparatus, formed a cage even for its masters. To question the system was to betray it, and to betray it meant losing everything. So even those who saw the flaws, the stagnation, the paranoia, the absurdity, were forced to play along. They repeated slogans they no longer believed. They signed off on policies they privately doubted. They ruled, yes, but from within a gilded prison built by loyalty and fear. The United States experienced a different version of this paradox. US presidents were free to speak of peace, but constrained by the military-industrial complex, public expectation, and strategic entanglements across the globe. Dwight Eisenhower, a former general himself, warned of this system in his farewell address, cautioning against the growing power of a permanent arms industry with the ability to shape national policy. Yet, during his own presidency, he oversaw massive defense spending and the escalation of Cold War rhetoric. John F. Kennedy found himself boxed in during the Cuban Missile Crisis, surrounded by advisors urging war, by generals planning airstrikes, by allies demanding firmness. He had to navigate a minefield of expectations where even appearing weak could destabilize alliances. In those 13 days of October 1962, Kennedy held the most powerful office in the world, and yet he was more trapped than ever. A single misstep could have ended everything. In China, Mao Zedong ruled with cult-like authority during the Cultural Revolution. His word was law, his image everywhere. But as the chaos he unleashed spiraled out of control, he found himself unable to stop it without undermining his own myth. He had built a system in which dissent was eradicated and obedience was absolute. And in doing so, he lost the ability to pivot, to reform, to acknowledge error. His power had become a prison. Even leaders within smaller nations experienced this paradox. In East Germany, Erich Honecker controlled a police state built on surveillance and control. But he was beholden to the will of Moscow. When Soviet support waned under Gorbachev's reforms, Honecker clung to old doctrines, refusing to change, not because he didn't see the writing on the wall, but because stepping out of line meant collapse. His power was conditional. The moment he stopped performing the role, it was over, and in the intelligence world, figures like J. Edgar Hoover held immense institutional power. As head of the FBI for nearly 5 decades, Hoover operated beyond political oversight. But to maintain that autonomy, he cultivated an image of paranoia, moral conservatism, and aggressive anti-communism that locked him into a narrow identity. He was untouchable, and yet utterly bound to the persona he had created. The Cold War's structures of power, ideological, bureaucratic, militaristic, were designed for preservation, not flexibility. Leaders could command armies, but they couldn't dismantle the logic of fear that justified those armies. They could make speeches, but they couldn't speak freely. They could lead, but they couldn't leave. Prisoner holding power reveals a hidden cruelty at the heart of the Cold War. That those who seemed to shape history were often shaped by it. That the men in suits and uniforms, standing at podiums and waving from balconies, were often more constrained than the people they governed. Because real power in the Cold War wasn't the ability to act. It was the obligation to continue, to maintain the illusion, to repeat the script, to play the part, even when the stage was crumbling beneath them. And for many, the most terrifying realization was this: there was no exit, only performance, only continuity, only the sound of doors closing behind them, echoing louder the higher they climbed. We often think of peace as a destination, something that follows conflict, earned through negotiation or victory. But in the Cold War, peace came first. Before the shots were fired, before the battlefields were chosen, before the weapons were launched, there was peace, fragile, artificial, and enforced through fear. And rather than being built step by step from goodwill or understanding, this peace was constructed in reverse, from destruction downward, from apocalypse backward into silence. This is the paradox of peace built backwards. When peace is not the absence of war, but the byproduct of preparing endlessly for it. From the very beginning, the Cold War operated under the shadow of nuclear annihilation. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, ensured that no side could strike first without guaranteeing its own destruction. This logic, that only by preparing to destroy everything could anything be preserved, turned the idea of peace upside down. Peace didn't come from treaties or understanding, it came from threat. The more destructive your arsenal, the more stable your position. The more willing you were to go to the brink, the more likely you were to be left alone. Rationality was measured by your readiness to be irrational. The arms race itself was a backwards kind of diplomacy. Each new missile, each faster delivery system, each deadlier payload was framed not as a step toward war, but as an investment in peace. The theory was simple. If both sides had the power to annihilate the world many times over, neither side would dare to use it. And for decades, that theory held, but the cost was staggering. Trillions of dollars spent on weapons no one intended to use. Entire generations raised under the threat of sudden death. Cities planned with evacuation routes for scenarios that no one believed could be survived. It was a peace that required constant rehearsal for the end of the world. Even diplomacy followed this reversed logic. Agreements like SALT and START weren't born out of reconciliation, but from sheer exhaustion. Leaders didn't sit down because they wanted peace. They sat down because they realized the alternative had become unmanageable. Treaties capped the madness but never reversed it. They slowed the bleeding but didn't close the wound. Culturally, the effects were equally inverted. Films, literature, and music of the Cold War era were saturated with themes of annihilation. From Dr. Strangelove to The Day After, audiences consumed visions of the world ending, not in fire and fury, but in glitchy radar signals and bureaucratic confusion. Artists didn't imagine peace as a shining future. but as the grim reality of a world that hadn't ended yet. This backward peace also shaped identity. Nations defined themselves not by what they stood for, but by what they opposed. The West was not just capitalist, it was anti-communist. The East was not just socialist, it was anti-imperialist. Peace between them didn't mean friendship or even cooperation. It meant mutual refusal to collapse, a shared interest in not falling off the edge. Even education became a Cold War weapon, with science and math curriculums restructured not to improve society, but to produce better engineers for missile systems and space races. Young minds were trained for competition under the banner of progress, but that progress was always in service of deterrence, of not losing, of surviving, not thriving. And yet, despite all this, war never came in the way everyone feared. There was no nuclear exchange, no global invasion, no Third World War. Somehow it worked. The world walked backward into peace, building it from fear, from tension, from the loud absence of catastrophe. But it was never comfortable, it was never quiet, and it was never finished. Peace built backwards reveals how the Cold War didn't end in war, because it had already baked war into its foundation. It didn't resolve conflict, it suspended it indefinitely. The Cold War's greatest success was preventing its own worst-case scenario, but that prevention came at the cost of paranoia, repression, division, and decades of psychological unease. In the end, peace didn't grow in the sunlight. It took root in shadows. It was built backwards, brick by brick, with trembling hands and locked jaws. A structure so unstable that no one dared move too quickly, lest the whole thing fall apart. And perhaps that's why it lasted. Because in a world where everyone prepared endlessly for the end, no one had the strength left to start it. To defect in the Cold War was to escape. That was the myth. The moment a soldier, scientist, artist, or citizen crossed from east to west, or west to east, the world was supposed to open up. New opportunities, new freedoms, new beginnings. But the truth was more complicated. Defectors often found themselves not liberated, but relocated into new cages. They weren't just refugees, they were assets, liabilities, and symbols, and they were never truly trusted again. This is the paradox of the defector's double trap, when escaping one system meant being captured by another, and freedom came with a different kind of surveillance. When a defector fled the Soviet Union, they were usually welcomed with enthusiasm by the West at first. Headlines celebrated their arrival. Governments paraded them in front of cameras as proof that communism was a failure. But once the spotlight dimmed, the reality set in. These individuals were watched, interrogated, and often kept in isolation for months. Their stories were valuable, only as long as they served the narrative. The moment they stopped cooperating, or started saying things that didn't align with official messaging, they became inconvenient. Some were absorbed into military or intelligence structures. Others were given new identities, relocated, and essentially placed under quiet house arrest. For many, the price of leaving was a life of permanent dislocation, unable to return, unable to fully belong where they had arrived. Scientists who defected were often the most tightly controlled. Their knowledge made them too dangerous to be free. The United States and its allies feared that if these individuals were allowed to move freely, they could be kidnapped, killed, or, worst of all, redefect. So, many were given restricted roles, their work compartmentalized, their movements monitored. Artists and writers fared no better. While some were given platforms to speak out against their former governments, others were pressured to produce anti-communist material on demand. If they tried to explore more nuanced or critical views, their support dried up. They weren't supposed to be complex. They were supposed to be proof. The Soviet Union had its own version of this trap. Defectors from the West, though rarer, were treated with great suspicion. The KGB saw every foreign arrival as a potential double agent. Even those who genuinely sympathized with socialist ideals, disillusioned intellectuals, peace activists, or ex-soldiers, were placed under surveillance, their contacts limited, their trust never fully earned. Their movements were scripted, their statements vetted. They had left one system of control, only to enter another. And when defectors regretted their decision, there was no way back. To defect was to cross a moral line in the eyes of your homeland. Return was betrayal. Forgiveness was rarely offered. Families left behind were often punished, jobs lost, lives surveilled. In defecting, a person didn't just leave a country. They erased their past, often at great personal cost. Some defectors never truly adjusted. They struggled with identity, loneliness, and the feeling that they belonged nowhere. They were hailed as heroes, but treated like threats. Their lives became case files, their movements calculated, their words weighed for political usefulness. One infamous case was that of Vitaly Yurchenko, a high-ranking KGB officer who defected to the United States in 1985 and then redefected back to the USSR just months later. His story confused and embarrassed both sides. Had he been a plant? Had he changed his mind? Was he playing a deeper game? The truth was lost in the layers of manipulation. What remained was the sense that no one, not even the defector himself, really had control. The Cold War's obsession with control made freedom conditional, especially for those who crossed lines. The defector was never just a person. They were a message, and messages are valuable only as long as they can be controlled. Defector's double trap exposes how the Cold War turned human lives into instruments, how the choice to leave one world often meant stepping into another where autonomy was just as elusive, even if the walls looked different. Freedom, in theory, was the reward, but in practice, it became another form of negotiation, another stage in a long performance of loyalty, usefulness, and suspicion. Because in the Cold War, you could leave your country, you could even leave your ideology, but you could never leave the game. Revolutions are supposed to topple tyranny, to break the cycle of oppression, tear down the walls of corruption, and rebuild something just. But the Cold War twisted this promise. Around the world, revolutions that began with cries for justice ended up preserving the very systems they meant to destroy. New faces took power, but old structures remained. The slogans changed, the uniforms changed, but the fear, the control, and the silence persisted. This is the paradox of revolution-saving tyranny. When the storm clears, and the throne is still standing. In Iran, the 1979 revolution ousted the US-backed Shah, whose regime was infamous for brutality and excess. Millions marched for freedom, equality, and a new era. But what followed was another form of control, an Islamic theocracy that centralized power in the hands of a few clerics. The tyrant had fallen, but tyranny found new language, new robes, and new prisons. In Nicaragua, the Sandinista revolution overthrew the Somoza dictatorship with promises of socialist reform and liberation. But the new regime quickly took on the hallmarks of the old one, silencing dissent, censoring media, and consolidating power. The US-funded Contras, claiming to fight tyranny, only added layers of chaos and suffering. Revolution became a loop, spinning back into the very oppression it tried to undo. Even within the Soviet bloc, revolutions wore strange masks. In post-World War II Eastern Europe, communist parties often rose to power through popular support. The promise of land, reform, workers' rights, and economic equality. But once in control, they dismantled civil society, crushed political opposition, and placed themselves above criticism. The revolutions of the people became regimes against the people. One of the clearest examples of this paradox was Romania. Nicolae Ceausescu rose through the communist ranks as a populist, criticizing the Soviet Union's heavy hand and presenting himself as a nationalist defender. But once in power, he built a personality cult so rigid and brutal that even the KGB kept their distance. His downfall in 1989 was swift and violent. The revolution that ended him was real. But for decades, his regime had been sustained by the myth of revolution itself. The Cold War turned revolution into theater. Both superpowers funded, directed, or manipulated uprisings around the globe, not to liberate people, but to install friendly regimes. In Africa, Asia, and Latin America, freedom fighters often became proxies. Their movements were armed, trained, and shaped not by their people's needs, but by distant ideological chessboards. In Cuba, Castro's revolution was seen as a victory against imperialism. But the authoritarian state that followed was supported for decades by the Soviet Union, not because it was free, but because it was useful. In Guatemala, the US supported a coup in the name of freedom from communism, which led to years of military dictatorship and civil war. The irony is brutal. Revolution, meant to bring renewal, became a tool for preserving power. Tyranny simply learned how to speak revolutionary. Even peaceful revolutions weren't immune. In Czechoslovakia, the 1968 Prague Spring tried to reform socialism from within, to create a more open, humane version of the system. But Soviet tanks rolled in, declaring the reform movement a threat to unity. The rhetoric of revolution was used to crush real change. It took another 20 years, and the Velvet Revolution, for that nation to finally shake free. Revolution. Saving tyranny teaches us that the shape of change is not always what it seems, that sometimes systems survive by wearing the clothes of rebellion, that people can be inspired by slogans while being controlled by the same chains, just painted in different colors. And in the Cold War, where every revolution was watched, measured, and often manipulated by outside forces, true transformation became nearly impossible. The tyrants were clever. They learned how to shout with the voice of the people. They learned how to survive the storm by claiming they were the storm, and in doing so, they turned revolution into a circle, one that spun and spun, but never broke. In most stories, secrets come out eventually, files are opened, truths are revealed, and time marches on with clarity. But in the Cold War, information didn't expire. It metastasized. Documents were locked away, redacted beyond meaning, or quietly rewritten. Even when files were opened, they revealed more confusion than truth. Half stories, double agents, doctored timelines. It was a war that never fully ended because its paper trail never fully stopped. This is the paradox of files never closed, when history is permanently suspended in a state of classified uncertainty. The Cold War produced an ocean of documentation, surveillance reports, interrogation transcripts, wiretap logs, diplomatic cables, code books, and psychological profiles. Every embassy, every military outpost, every spy station became a producer of paper, and while some files were destroyed in panicked bonfires, many were stored in vaults, basements, and anonymous offices, unread, unverified, and toxic with implication. In the United States, the Freedom of Information Act was supposed to unlock the truth. But even now, Cold War-era files are released with entire pages blacked out. Some documents have been lost, others were never written down, and still more are released decades later, revealing that much of what the public once believed was based on deliberate fabrication, planted news, psychological warfare, or staged defections. Take Project MKUltra, the CIA's infamous mind control program. For years its existence was denied. Then, fragments of it were declassified, revealing a chilling network of drug experiments, hypnosis trials, and unethical psychiatric manipulation. But the majority of files were destroyed in 1973, under the order of CIA Director Richard Helms. What remains are ghosts, partial stories, untraceable leads, names without faces. In the Soviet Union, secrecy was even more profound. The KGB maintained meticulous records, not only of foreign targets, but of their own citizens. Yet when the USSR collapsed, those records were selectively opened, manipulated, or hidden again. In some former Soviet states, access to the archives became a political weapon. One government would release certain files to discredit a rival. Others would suppress them to preserve fragile national narratives. Germany's Stasi files offer one of the most intimate views of surveillance gone mad. The East German secret police kept detailed records on millions of citizens, their habits, fears, friends, and conversations. After reunification, those files were open to the public, and people discovered that neighbors, lovers, even family members had spied on them. The trauma didn't end with the regime. It echoed in the revelations. But not all files were opened. In the UK, the Official Secrets Act kept Cold War documents sealed long past their relevance. In China, records from purges and revolutions remain buried. In the US, covert operations in Latin America, Africa, and Southeast Asia remain partly or fully classified, hidden under the logic of national security. And sometimes, the files that never closed didn't stay locked because of bureaucracy, but because of ambiguity. The identities of some spies were never confirmed. The full motives behind certain defections were never revealed. Mysterious deaths, political suicides, and diplomatic incidents remain unsolved. Their files reopened again and again with each new theory. This state of perpetual secrecy breeds a kind of historical paranoia. Without clear endings, every story remains suspect. Every death might have been a cover-up. Every revolution, a staged operation. Every leader, a puppet. It becomes impossible to trust even the evidence. Truth drowns in the flood of half-truths. Files never closed reminds us that history is not just about what happened, but about what is remembered and who controls the memory. In the Cold War, facts became weapons. Archives were battlegrounds. and silence was a strategy. Even now, decades later, historians, journalists, and citizens dig through these files hoping to find closure. But more often than not, they find gaps, disappearances, conveniently missing pages. And so, the war continues, not on the battlefield, but in the mind. In the effort to piece together a past that was deliberately shattered. Because when the files never close, the story never ends. And the truth becomes another casualty of the dream. Borders are meant to define separation, where one country ends and another begins, where laws shift and cultures diverge. In times of peace, borders are crossed by travelers, traders, and ideas. In times of war, they are contested and redrawn. But during the Cold War, many borders became something else entirely. They did not move, nor did they allow movement. They froze, and so did the people near them. This is the paradox of borders without movement, when the lines meant to divide also imprisoned, and the stillness of a map concealed the chaos beneath. The most iconic of these frozen borders was the Berlin Wall. Erected overnight in 1961, it split a single city, and symbolically the entire world, into East and West. Families were separated in the space of a few hours. Streets ended in concrete. Windows were bricked up. Over the next 28 years, the wall stood not only as a barrier, but as a message. Movement was treason. Curiosity was betrayal. To cross the line was to risk death. And yet, the line itself never moved. On paper, borders like the Iron Curtain were stable, but around them swirled militarization, propaganda, defection attempts, and constant surveillance. They were tense zones of absolute stasis, paradoxically volatile in their stillness. Nothing could move, because anything that moved was suspicious. In Korea, the demilitarized zone, DMZ, between North and South became one of the most heavily fortified strips of land on Earth. 2 miles wide, lined with landmines, electric fences, and thousands of troops, it remains a monument to a war that never officially ended. Peace talks came and went. Armistices were signed, but the line remains. No peace, no war, just permanent alert. Similar borders emerged all over the world, dividing not just land, but ideology. The India-Pakistan line of control in Kashmir, the inter-German border, the 38th parallel, all became physical representations of unresolved fear. People who lived near these borders often became invisible. Their homes were abandoned or tightly policed. Entire villages faded into silence, becoming collateral to a line on a map. But the stillness was an illusion. These frozen zones were among the most active parts of the Cold War. Spies crossed in the dead of night. Leaflets were dropped by balloons. Radios blasted propaganda over barbed wire. Each side constructed elaborate defenses, not just to keep the enemy out, but to keep their own citizens in. Movement wasn't just blocked, it was punished. In East Germany, people risked everything to cross the border into the West. Some dug tunnels, others tried hot air balloons or forged documents. Most failed, many died. But the persistence of escape attempts revealed a painful truth. Even borders that seem immovable are constantly challenged by human will. And yet, the more people tried to move, the more the system hardened. Surveillance expanded. Technology improved. Walls got taller. Guards got orders to shoot. The act of fleeing became political, and so did the act of staying. Everyone near a border was a suspect. not for what they had done, but for what they might be thinking. The paradox extended. Beyond physical space, intellectual and cultural borders were drawn as well. Ideas couldn't cross easily. Books were banned, films were smuggled, academics needed clearance to travel. Thought itself was compartmentalized by invisible lines. Even after the Cold War ended, these borders cast long shadows. Reunified Germany still bears scars from the Berlin Wall. Korea remains divided. The echoes of ideological division linger in global politics, often traced back to those frozen lines. Borders without movement reminds us that a lack of motion is not the same as peace, that silence can be enforced, that immobility can be violent, and it warns us. Just because a map looks unchanged doesn't mean the people living along its edges are safe or free, because during the Cold War, stillness didn't mean stability. It meant tension stretched to its limits, a taut wire humming with the pressure of what couldn't be crossed. Enemies are meant to oppose. They're the other, the threat, the ones who must be stopped or overcome. But in the Cold War, the concept of the enemy twisted itself into something surreal. Former foes became allies overnight. Dictators were defended in the name of democracy. Ideologies were traded for resources. And in the most jarring cases, those once labeled as villains were handed medals, funds, and protection. Not because they changed, but because it was suddenly convenient to do so. This is the paradox of foe turned savior. When yesterday's enemy becomes today's necessary friend, and morality bends to the shape of strategy. Nowhere was this more evident than in the post-WPUT restructuring of global alliances. As the Iron Curtain descended, Western powers scrambled to contain communism. And in that rush, they turned to men they had once condemned. Nazi scientists, officials, and intelligence agents were quietly absorbed into American and British programs. Operation Paperclip brought figures like Werner von Braun, former members of Hitler's rocket program, into NASA's heart. The justification: if we didn't take them, the Soviets would. The same logic applied elsewhere. In Latin America, the US backed military juntas and right-wing regimes that committed atrocities against their own populations, all in the name of fighting leftist insurgencies. The enemy wasn't repression or tyranny. The enemy was communism, and anyone who stood against it, no matter how brutal, could be labeled a partner in freedom. In Chile, General Pinochet led a violent coup in 1973 with covert CIA support, toppling the democratically elected socialist Salvador Allende. Thousands were tortured or disappeared. Yet Pinochet was embraced by segments of the West as a stabilizing force. In Indonesia, Suharto rose to power after a bloody anti-communist purge that killed 500,000 people. The US response? Silence, then support. On the other side, the USSR made similar deals. They funded revolutionary movements and armed brutal regimes across Africa and Asia, not because they believed in local justice, but because those groups opposed Western influence. From Angola to Afghanistan, Cold War logic turned battlegrounds into abstractions. Whoever bled the right direction got the aid. Perhaps the most complex example of this paradox was China. Initially aligned with the Soviet bloc, Mao's regime was deeply hostile to Western interests. But as the Sino-Soviet split deepened, the US saw an opportunity. By the 1970s, President Nixon visited Beijing, shaking hands with the same leaders, who had once been painted as the greatest threats to freedom. Mao's China didn't become less authoritarian. It became strategically useful, and so foes became saviors not by redemption, but by alignment. Ideals were negotiable, Expediency was not. This reshuffling wasn't limited to nations. It extended to individuals. Spies caught red-handed were flipped and turned into double agents. Arms dealers and drug traffickers were quietly enlisted for covert operations. Dissidents once labeled as dangerous were later courted as allies when they switched sides. Yesterday's traitor could be today's hero, and vice versa. The Cold War's ideological battlefield blurred morality to the point of inversion. The measure of good was no longer based on action or principle, but on utility. Who can help us today? Who hurts our enemy more than they hurt us? These were the questions that drove policy, not justice, not truth. And for the people caught in between, the result was confusion, betrayal, and often disaster. Populations watched as their tormentors were suddenly legitimized. Victims saw their stories erased in the name of strategy. Heroes became outcasts. Enemies became presidents. Foe turned savior is a reminder that in geopolitics, the compass spins wildly. That history is often rewritten in real time, depending on who holds the pen. And it leaves us with a bitter truth. In the Cold War, you didn't need to be good to be valued. You just had to be useful. Because when the world is divided into two camps, every friend is temporary and every enemy has a future. The Cold War was called cold because the great powers never clashed directly in open combat. There were no trenches stretching across Europe, no air raids blackening cities in the night. But to call it cold is misleading. It burned quietly, steadily, and endlessly, through minds, policies, families, borders, and time. It wasn't just a geopolitical standoff. It was a global hallucination, a dream that shaped reality, a dream that dreamed itself into being. This is the final paradox. War dreaming. When the war becomes so woven into the fabric of life that it continues long after the enemies have disappeared. For nearly half a century, the Cold War defined how people lived, worked, spoke, voted, prayed, and dreamed. Children practiced hiding from bombs that never fell. Citizens memorized ideologies they didn't fully understand. Leaders built bunkers beneath their cities and told the world everything was under control. But the real war wasn't just between the US and the USSR. It was between imagination and truth, between fear and fact, between what might happen and what must be prevented. It was a war of what-ifs, a theater of shadows, where every action was shaped by the possibility of destruction, and the longer it lasted, the more it became self-sustaining. Each missile built required the other side to build two. Each treaty signed was followed by 3 more contingencies. Peace talks happened beside weapons tests. Human rights declarations were written as dissidents were silenced. The dream of safety became indistinguishable from the machinery of control, and within it, people adapted. They found humor in the absurdity, strength in the small rebellions, love in the margins. In a world ruled by paranoia, they whispered the truth when they couldn't say it. In a world of secrets, they preserved dignity through small, quiet acts, teaching, helping, resisting. Life persisted, even inside the dream. But the dream shaped them. It didn't end with the fall of the Berlin Wall or the collapse of the Soviet Union. Its logic remained, embedded in policies, in surveillance systems, in militarized economies, in the deep psychology of nations. The Cold War trained the world to think in terms of enemies and alliances, deterrents and countermeasures. It taught entire generations to fear peace as a trap and see diplomacy as weakness. Even today, the remnants of that logic echo. The weapons still exist. The intelligence networks have grown more advanced. Borders still hum with the anxiety of old ghosts, and the idea of total security, that seductive myth, still justifies new wars, new walls, new technologies of control. The Cold War was never just about ideology, it was about control over the future. Each side wanted to define not only the present, but what tomorrow would look like. It was a war of narratives, and in many ways, the narrative won. Even now, long after the flags have changed and the walls have fallen, the world still dreams Cold War dreams. It dreams of enemies too large to understand, of threats too quiet to see, of conflicts too complex to resolve. It dreams of peace through strength, of loyalty through fear, of truth as something negotiable. But paradoxically, the Cold War also gave us a mirror. It showed us how fragile peace is when built on weapons, how identity collapses when founded on opposition, how knowledge can become a trap, and how even power becomes a prison. War dreaming is the state we enter when we build our lives around an imagined conflict, until the conflict becomes real. And now that the dream is fading, slowly, unevenly, but undeniably, we are left with questions. What do we build in its place? Can peace be imagined as vividly as war? Can we teach our children to dream differently, of connection, not suspicion, of strength measured in compassion, not conquest? The Cold War taught us many things, most of them contradictory, but perhaps its most haunting lesson is this: that a war does not need to be fought with guns to leave scars. It only needs to be believed in. And so we wake, slowly, from the dream. But the imprint remains, because in the Cold War, the war never had to start. It only had to be dreamt.